Welcome my friends in another Angular 17 video. Today we're talking about components interaction with inputs and outputs. And there will be another video for component interaction with signal service and also subject service. So stay tuned for that one. Let's not waste any more time and dive right in. I have a cool shopping cart in here. As you see, each item in the cart has a name, a price, and also a quantity that we can increase and decrease, but that is not yet functional. So the aim is to move that cart item li elements that we have in here into its own Angular component and then use that component in here instead. I want to show you around quickly first. So as you see, I have a for loop that iterates over the products array that I have down there. That array have only two products. Each product has an ID, name, price, and quantity. And the only function that I have down there is to calculate the total price. All right, let's start by creating the cart item component. I will use the CLI to do exactly that. So we'll use the ng-generate command for it. Here we go. And here is our component. So it's a standalone by default, which is awesome. What we need to do now is just move the li element that we have in the shopping cart component all over to the cart item component. And also I'll be moving the li styles that I have to the cart item component as well. Perfect. As you see now, it doesn't recognize the product variable because it's not declared in the cart item component yet. So let's declare it down there. So we need a property of type product. I have the product type created already in the models folder. And now the cart item component looks good, no errors in there. What we can do is to update the selector to the name we want. I will just call it cart item. And that selector would be basically our tag name when we use that component anywhere. We just need to import it first and wherever you need to use it. So let's add the cart item component in here, and it can be self-closed thanks to that new feature in Angular 17, since it doesn't have any content inside of it. By that I mean like between the opening tag and the closing tag, if you don't have any HTML content inside, you can self-close it. All right, if we save our changes, you see that our cart items is empty. And that is basically because of the product property that we declared in the cart item component doesn't have any value inside of it, right? So what we need to do is the shopping cart should be able to send the cart item data from that products array that we have in there to the cart item component. And in order to do that, in order to be able to pass this data to the product property that we have in the cart item, we need to prefix it with something called input. So input is something built in Angular. If you prefix a property with the input directive, that property becomes an attribute that you can use alongside the cart item HTML element. As you see here, we can add the product attribute in the cart item element and pass the product data to it. Right, let's save our changes. Now looking good, right? We can even take this further and make that input required. Since the cart item component doesn't make any sense without the product data, we can make the product property required. So if you try to use the cart item component without setting the product property, as you see, it will give you an error that says the product property is required and must be specified. Perfect. Now we have the product input in place. What we can do now is we can intercept the data that is coming in and do some extra logic to it. So I want to know how many items are left in the stock for each cart item I have. For instance, I want to say that only 3 items left. So I have a function that I already created in the stock.ts file. That function takes the product ID and returns the quantity for you. So we can import that function in here. And down there, I will convert our product property to a setter and getter functions. By doing so, I'll be able to intercept any data that is coming in the product property. So the product setter gets a data of type product. We need a variable called stock up there, and the stock variable will basically equals the returned quantity from the get stock function that we imported, and we will pass the product ID in there, and that ID is the one that came from the parent component, from the shopping cart component. So we intercepted that ID and used it to get how many of that item is left in the stock. What we also need to do, the product property has become a setter function, so it's not able to save data inside of it. So we need a variable to do that for us. So I'll create a variable called item, and we can pass a copy of the product data to that item, and then we can create a getter function for the product that returns back the item variable. I will replace the number 3 with the real quantity that is coming from the getStock function. If it's for any reason undefined, I'll replace it with 0, and we can save our changes, and here we go, looking really good. And that, my friends, was how you intercept the data when sending it to a child component using an input property. All right, what we need to do right now is to make plus and minus buttons work. So we need to add more items or reduce the number of items. To do that, the parent component needs to know that this button inside of the child component has been clicked. We will propagate that event from the child component to the parent component using something called output. Output is also a built-in directive in Angular that you can use to propagate a certain event to the parent component. So we need 2 events, one to add a new item, another one is to remove an item. So I'll create 2 outputs, add and remove, that are basically an event emitter. Event emitter is also built in Angular, and you can import it from the Angular core. And in order to use that, inside of the buttons, we'll add a click event handler. So when you click the button, this function will be triggered. We'll create a function called updateQuantity. That function takes an action. So the action is either remove or add. So let's create the function down there. So the function takes an action that is either add or remove. And we'll create a switch case that checks for the action property. If it's add, it will emit the add event, and if it's remove, it will emit the remove event. All right, in order for the parent component to catch those events, you can now use the 2 outputs that we created in the child component as a custom event handler now. So we can add the add event handler and the remove event handler in the cart item component. So in case of the add event, it will trigger a function called updateQuantity that we will create in the parent component. And this time it takes an action and a product ID. And we'll do the same for both add and remove. And down there we'll create the updateQuantity function that takes an action that is either add or remove and also takes the product ID. The first thing we need to do is to find that product using the ID. And then we'll have a switch case for the action. So in case of add, we'll increase the product quantity, and in case of remove, we will decrease the product quantity if it's more than 0. One last thing we need to do is to recalculate the total. I think that will be it. Let's save our changes, and it works. Amazing. So we can now increase the quantity of any item or decrease it, and the total price will update accordingly. All right, my friends, that was it. That was it for today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.